My name is David.
And my name is Jason.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. Our first segment is What Happened Here Recently. Jason, you and I have gotten to play a good bit of Dungeon World lately. Did you want to talk about some of that?
Yeah, let's do it. So we have kicked off a brand new adventure in the We Hunt the Keepers campaign, which we've mentioned before on the show. This adventure is called The Bloody Road to Belet Osk. And I don't want to talk about the adventure so much yet, mostly because we've mostly just kind of done sort of session 0 stuff with it. We haven't really dived too much into the story yet, but you're doing an interesting thing. So you're actually playing a character who was connected to a previous character of yours who died. And I think that's what I want to talk about. What do you think? Does that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're referring to Isabella Strider, who was an NPC character in the very first We Hunt the Keepers. She ran into my then character, Logan Stormbreaker. They were mages together.
Yeah, she was kind of like a half villain, not quite a villain, but she was wrapped up in the mystery, right? Like she was definitely like one of your sort of target people or whatever.
Right. Yes. And her father had gone missing and was part of that adventure. So the fact that now Logan has gone missing felt really appropriate that she would step into the spotlight once again and become a played character, not just a non-player character.
Well, so it's super interesting for me because you're playing this character who had a connection to your previous character. Your previous character is dead. And your previous character, Logan, his story got cut short, right? I mean, essentially, like we got a good little arc in there in terms of like what he was, kind of what he was focused on and what he was doing. But nevertheless, it was cut short. And I find it really interesting because it seems to me like whether you're doing it intentionally or not, you're actually using this new character, Isabella, as a vehicle through which to kind of call back to his story a little bit and fill in some of the gaps. Like, is that something you're doing on purpose?
Well, yeah. So I wanted to play Isabella because I wanted to see more of that Logan story, because I know it could happen in Dungeon World where a character would come back to life, and I don't think that's going to happen. But I thought it would be interesting to explore the possibility of that. On a more meta level, I wasn't done with the Mage playbook. Like, there was more I wanted to see out of it.
Oh, that kind of makes sense. Okay, that's interesting.
But yes, I am interested to see this other kind of side of Logan, because he was very much like a professional wizard whenever he was on screen. But what I've done with Isabella is I just have spoken into reality that she has a correspondence with Logan.
Yeah, that's been super interesting. Yeah. So to catch listeners up, I guess, the idea is Isabella, the way you've been playing her, she has all these letters that she was writing back and forth with Logan while he was off on his adventures. And it's super interesting because there's been a couple of instances where you have used those letters as like the fictional justification for why Isabella might know something or to trigger spout lores or that kind of thing, right? And I just find that it's like really fascinating, like how you're using Isabella and her relationship with Logan, how you're using that like previous relationship to inform the fiction that we're doing now. It's just something I haven't really experienced yet in Dungeon World with all the sessions I've run. That's super cool.
Yeah, I'm having a ton of fun doing that, and I'm trying not to overdo it, but it's also kind of nice because me, the player, I already know some of the characters I'm adventuring with. So rather than have to relearn them for the sake of
right, yeah, you have an excuse for why you might know them and about them and stuff. Yeah, it's pretty, right. It does solve a lot of problems at the table, I've discovered. So, which is nice. It smooths some things out between new character and previous characters. So, anyway, I thought it was super interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting to play this character that I was introduced to as an NPC, and I'm really taking her in kind of a more dark road because she's kind of a tragic character up to this point as far as we have seen her, and I don't know if that's going to get any better. Probably not. But
yeah, it's the way you're playing her. It's almost like she's angry. You know, like she's got this like really intense anger about maybe what happened to Logan, maybe about just their general circumstances, you know, because there's a lot of tragedy kind of like hanging over her, right? Just, you know, even both as an NPC and like, or I should say as an NPC in that original story and her connections with Logan and losing Logan, like that tragedy. Yeah, there's definitely like this sort of like, I am angry and I'm pissed and everything I'm doing is like sort of exercising that anger. And so, yeah, I'll be curious to see if she gets a redemption, if she even needs a redemption, you know, she could just be angry. That's cool, right?
Right. Yeah. And I don't know if it might just be kind of one of those like bad things come to bad people sometimes. And she's lost her father. She's lost Logan. And those were both really, really tragic things that have come about in her life. But she's not been a very, you know, innocent person.
She's not. No. Yeah.
I will be curious to see if she finds any way of communicating with Logan beyond the veil or bringing him back in any way. That would be really interesting if that were to happen in some way.
We shall see. Are you hinting that's what you want me to
do? No, I'm just like, I wouldn't be surprised if it never happened, but I would be very, very curious to see what would happen if it did.
I'll be very curious, or I'll be very interested in dangling that possibility in front of you and then just never fulfilling it. So
that would serve Isabella right.
I feel good. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's move on to our next segment.
Hi, listeners. I want to interject real quickly to remind you that Gauntlet Con is taking place October 20th through the 22nd. Gauntlet Con is an online gaming convention. We have over 100 gaming events for you to join. Early registration for Gauntlet Patreon supporters is taking place right now. Leading up to Gauntlet Con, our zine, Codex, will be holding a writing contest called Keepers of the Gauntlet. For this contest, we're asking you to write a Dungeon World starter or OSR scenario. There is a $100 cash prize for the winner, and the winning scenario will be published in Codex and be featured on one of our podcasts. Up to 2 runners-up will receive a $50 cash prize. Anyone can participate. The deadline for submissions is October 16th. For more details, find the link in our show notes or go to gauntlet-rpg.com. Thanks.
Our next segment is What Should I Be on the Lookout For?
So we have a couple of resources for you this week. 2 things on this segment. That's first, I think. The first is going to be the Dungeon World Newsletter put together by Colin Kieran. David, you might recall we covered Colin's custom move page. He has a blog called Vindexus where he has a bunch of custom moves. I don't remember what episode that was, but this is something he put together.
Yeah, I do recall that now that you mention it. This newsletter is great, by the way. It's very, very good, just kind of pulling all the community together, all the content creators that are putting kind of free stuff out in the world and keeping it all in one place.
Yeah, it's terrific. I've got the most recent of these Dungeon World newsletters pulled up, and he's got... In this one, there is a link to a campaign starter by Jeremy Strandberg. There is a monster by Johnstone Metzger. He has links to articles. There's one, Rethinking How XP Works, a thing by Joe Banner called Corpse Glade, a link to episode 50 of this show, which is very kind of him. Links to Andrew Huffaker's podcast, all that. It's just all this stuff connected to Dungeon World, blog posts and comment threads. And products. It's really neat. I like it a lot. It's very handy actually for the show. Like it's fun to pull up and just kind of look at all the different things and see if there's anything we want to talk about.
Yeah, it's pretty fantastic. The second thing that we have for listeners is, so Tomer has put together a resource based on a discussion that Tim Franske was having about how to do a good first session of Dungeon World.
And that was 100 years ago, by the way. That was like 1,000,000 years ago on the Dungeon World Tavern. I remember that. I was first getting into Dungeon World and Tim was posting about that.
Yeah. So Tomer took that and just a little while ago put them all together onto a sheet that you can print out onto index-sized cards, little cheat sheet cards to help a first session Dungeon World really, really sing. And I've looked it over, and Tomer got to try it out at Games on Demand, a session at Strategicon. He reports that it worked really well, and I can see why. This is a good little resource. What do you think about it?
I'm looking at it for the first time right now. I remember those original resources and discussions that Tim was having on the early days of the tavern, but I'm looking at this right now, and this is pretty neat. I mean, the way he's got them like ready to print on index cards, or you could just, print them up on sheets of paper and cut them out or whatever too. But for example, the barbarian, he's got he lists all these little things that are good little reminders about the barbarian class. For example, if they have outsider, ask them about their homeland, right? That I always forget to do that. I usually don't do that until the middle of the session because I forgot to do it at the beginning, right? There's a note about the appetite and triggering it for the D8. He notes that weapons are forceful and messy, and just some other little things. The bard, it has a little mention of the instrument being a story hook, how you can use that. Making note of what the bardic lore area is right there on the little card, so that's a thing that the player's interested in. It's neat. It's really handy. It's little things that I guess you could just wait on the player to say, oh, I'm interested in this, or don't forget this, or don't forget that. But if you want to be kind of like Johnny on it, and you want to, you yourself want to be on top of that and make sure to incorporate those things, it's pretty cool.
Right. Yeah, this would be particularly useful for a con game or for playing with a completely new table or with a new player, so that you are aware as the GM of these are the things that I need to make happen for that particular playbook. So that way they can see how Dungeon World sings.
That's a great use for these, right? Yeah, that's super cool. One of the things when you're running Dungeon World for brand new people, you always want it to be a great experience. I always do. I always want Dungeon World to be the best role playing game experience they've had, right? And yeah, this is a great tool. Little reminders of things that you can highlight or emphasize or call out on their playbook that can help them feel awesome. So yeah, I'm super into this.
Yeah. Also, probably a terrific resource for the newer GM who wants to make sure that they're making it sing and maybe hasn't picked up on that their GM or a GM that they has been doing these things. But it's a great resource.
Cool. Yeah, well, I guess we'll have links to both of these things in the show notes.
Yeah. Let's move on to our next segment. Our next segment is What Here Is Not What It Appears to Be.
So listeners, the first 50 episodes of Discern Realities, this segment covered pretty big ticket items. Alignment, bonds, spotlight in combat, right? We are going to take a slightly different tack for the foreseeable future, where we're going to narrow the scope of this segment and maybe just talk about very particular specific things on the playbooks and things. So we're going to start with my favorite move on my favorite playbook, which is the Heirloom move on the Fighter playbook. And I thought it would be interesting to go through the move, David, and just talk about some of the ways of making this move really cool at the table, okay?
Yeah, I didn't realize this was your favorite move until you just mentioned it. That's really interesting to me.
Well, I might be overstating it a bit. The Fighter's definitely my favorite playbook. That's on the record. I've stated that. Uh-huh. The Heirloom move is very good. I like the Blacksmith move, too.
I like the Blacksmith move a lot. I haven't seen the Heirloom move that often. My players do not pick it very often.
Yeah, so let's just read the move real quickly. Heirloom. When you consult the spirits that reside within your signature weapon, they will give you an insight relating to the current situation and might ask you some questions in return. Roll plus charisma. On a 10 plus, the GM will give you good detail. On a 7 to 9, the GM will give you an impression. So I thought we should just go part by part and kind of break the move apart a little bit and see if there are things we can discuss to maybe make this move super interesting, right? Or more interesting.
Yeah.
So when you consult the spirits, well, okay, so the trigger is really important, right? I mean, I'm imagining most of the time I've seen this move in action, what the players do is they grab their weapon, they get on one knee, and they pray or meditate with their weapon, right? That's kind of how that usually goes, but I don't think it has to, right? I mean, I think there's some space there to let the player come up with something more unique or to really show their character's personality. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that it really needs to be it doesn't even really need to be like a contemplative moment. It could be fairly, like, it could be a very action segment where this were to happen. You could trigger it in certain ways to make that happen.
Yeah, I can imagine a situation, for example, where maybe, you have, like, your fighter is the sort of, like, maybe like they're a character who's like slightly unhinged, or they come across as slightly unhinged. And so maybe they're like talking to their weapon while they're in the middle of a fight, right? And that could be triggering the heirloom move, right?
Right. Or it could be like, if you've ever read the Wheel of Time series, or at least the first book in that one, when they get into combat, they start to speak things that they don't even know what they're saying, that are like ancient war cries that have no relevance to them or their situation. It is the blood within them calling out.
Yeah, that's super cool. So yeah, at the outset, maybe have a little conversation with the players and find out if they want to put like a more unique stamp on what the trigger means for them. Second thing, the spirits, will give you insight into the current situation. So this is the real big part here. Like, what does this look like on screen, right? I think for most people, it's going to be the GM just affects a sort of ghostly voice. Maybe if they're even doing that, they might just start talking, right? But basically, I'm imagining the way it's going to happen at most tables is the GM is just going to like talk in the voice of the ancestors, right? And answer the characters' questions that way. But there's a lot of room there to do something more interesting, right?
Right. Yeah, I can definitely see, like, at first reading, this sounds like I look at my sword and then a ghost comes out. But it doesn't have to be that.
Yeah.
It could be
that,
but it doesn't have to be that.
Right. So I have seen that. I had a character once whose sort of like evil crone grandmother was trapped in the sword. It wasn't an heirloom as much as it was like just a phylactery for her spirit. And whenever he would communicate with her, that's what would happen. Like, he would know she was communicating with him or she was present because she would like, do creepy shit like, stroke the back of his neck and breathe down his neck and things like that, hiss and whatnot, right? She was kind of like a witch. I've seen that. In The Bloody Road to Baladosk with Rich's character, Rutger, what we're doing is, and I didn't actually ask Rich this, if that's how I wanted it, I just started doing it. But basically, whenever he asks his sword, I can't remember the name of the sword. It's really metal though. But
Twilight Reaver.
Twilight Reaver, yeah. When he asks Twilight Reaver a question, when he consults it, what I do is I show a glimpse of ancestral memory. So I show like some of his ancestors, great uncles or aunts or whatever, engaged in some kind of scene. And that scene has some kind of relevance to his current situation. So, for example, he once consulted it to find out how to get into the cathedral without getting the attention of this monster that was in the cathedral. And so he consulted the sword, and I showed a vision of like some ancestor, aunt and uncle of his when they were little kids, like sneaking into a church through the back window near the altar to like steal the altar wine, right? And that was like the heirloom's way of saying, go around back, right? So I thought that was a really great way of doing it. It's kind of adds some texture. It shows the history of his family and things like that.
Yeah, I liked that scene with kind of asking some questions about his family and having him answer and learning a bit more about his backstory in that way. It felt more natural than like any other way of learning about somebody's family besides like a campfire scene or something.
Yeah. The heirloom move, it's a great opportunity to do that, right? Like, because I feel like whenever a player chooses that move, they're goalposting to you as the GM. I want to explore this aspect of my character. I want to explore my character's family, right? And what that means and how they affect me. And so, yeah, the move is a great opportunity to show those things. And like you said, to ask questions that sort of draw those things out. Right.
I think that this move gets overlooked, at least at my tables, because it seems at first blush to be a lot like a Discern Realities or a Spout Lore. But I think that might be a little bit of just a missed opportunity by them not choosing it to to learn different kinds of things and things about their family and their backstory. It's definitely a more fictional, like, reward of a move rather than a mechanical reward of the move. And and a lot of those fighter moves are really mechanically rewarding. So
yeah, it's a good observation for sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Do you see a significant advantage to this move over a Spout Lore or Discern Realities?
In the sense that basically the way you've just put it, it's a chance for you to flesh out the character a little bit, right? And to flesh out their history. I think in that regard, it is, there's a table advantage. It's more interesting in that way. Mechanical advantage, I'm not sure.
It's plus charisma. I suppose it's a different stat.
Yeah, it's a different stat, which is one thing. And then I suppose, I don't know, because one of the things that you can do in the move as the GM is you can ask them some questions in return, and that could actually be negative, right? Like if the spirits in the sword like have some ulterior motives, like maybe it gives you the chance as a GM to sort of like, to sort of like explore those ulterior motives and maybe, have some importance, going on or whatever. So
Right. Yeah. I think if I was going to change any one thing about this move, I would write in a 6- result so that the player who chose it knew that, like, what the outcome would be on a 6-. So that way the GM cannot just necessarily make a hard move, and they would be more prone to be like seeing this as a better opportunity for a Spout Lore Discern Realities kind of moment.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, to me, like I like to embrace that negativity, and I would hope like most players would sort of like lean into that complication or that difficulty, right? But I guess if you have a table of players who are really interested in like, either like mechanical advantage or balance, I suppose that's one thing. But anyway, kind of going back to the move here. So one thing, so good detail versus an impression. Okay. That's a bit vague, right? It's really, really open to interpretation, but it's actually pretty easy. And I just want to kind of point it out because this is something that whenever I'm chatting with people, sometimes they have a hard time with stuff like this when they're first starting to GM Dungeon World. The real important moving part there for good detail versus an impression is that the impression omits a critical bit of information. Like that's the main thing, right? Like if there's a thing that they need to know, like the impression is just that thing minus something important, right? I think that's the main kind of like sort of guiding like principle there in terms of like how to convey that. Does that make sense?
I think so. A good detail about their current situation would be like the next thing that they need to help them move along. An impression would just be either really vague, so they would have to puzzle it out for themselves a little bit more, or maybe like it would just be missing, like something, a critical detail, like, oh, this is the way that we need to go, but I didn't tell you there was a trap that way.
Exactly, precisely, right? Yeah. It's not as hard as all that. Ultimately, I mean, you can kind of get away with anything, right? Like, there's no wrong answer on that, right? But to the extent that you feel as a GM like you need to have a spectrum of the information there, I think one easy thing to do is to leave out something critical. Going back to a miss. So, what about a miss, right? I think on a miss, you can reveal bad information. You can do a grimportent there. I think that's a great move on a miss. Something else, though, and I kind of hinted at this already, is you can give the spirits and the weapons something they want and then, try to give the PC a reason for why they might want to pursue that thing, right? You can even go as hard as doing the mind control move on them, right? That's something we've talked about before, and it's detailed in the Discern Realities Annual, if you haven't picked that up yet. But you could do the mind control move, right? Where you take some hold on the character and basically can spend that hold to offer an option to the player character of taking an action that would be pleasing to the spirits. And if they do it, they get an XP. So you can do something like that, right? Basically start to assert the spirits' dominance or assert their independence or start to pursue their motivations and their plans. That
would be realistic, especially if it's the kind of spirit that's coming out of it that's like a manifest ghost or something like that would potentially try and control you. That would make a lot of sense in many situations.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think I have anything else here. I have one other note, which I'll just throw out there as a little cool scene detail. If you go my route where with the Rutger character, where you kind of show a scene from their past, like you show some of their ancestors playing out a scene as a way of answering the question. And if you want to ask the player character some questions in return, a really creepy thing you can do is while you're dictating the scene to them, you can have one of those characters turn and break the fourth wall in the scene and ask the player character a question, like in the middle of the scene. That should give them that's a good little creep out moment and a way of kind of handling that part of the move. So,
yeah, that's a neat little thing that you could do there.
Yeah. I can't wait to spring that on Rich at some point. So.
Awesome. Let's move on to our next segment. Our next segment is What Here is Useful or Valuable to Me?
So, listeners, a long time ago, this has been probably about 3 years or 4 years now, something like that. It's been a while. We did a special event in Face-to-Face Houston Gauntlet called Mandatory Fun Club, and the purpose of it was to do things that were a little bit unusual, like not just play role-playing games, but, for example, we're going to watch a movie and then make a role-playing game out of that movie.
Right.
That's as an example. One of the events we chose to do for Mandatory Fun Club, and David is here cringing on camera, I wish you could see it. One of the things we chose to do was not safe for work Dungeon World monsters. And so we all got together. We broke up into teams of like 2 or 3. There's a bunch of us. And we began creating not safe for work Dungeon World monsters. I'm not going to go into a lot of those because they're really fucking embarrassing. And they are things that I would never, ever put out into the world because they're so embarrassing and they're so bad. It was a great time. It was really fun. Lots of laughter. We want to share the most charming of those monsters. The most charming of those monsters that came out of NSFW, Dungeon World Monsters, was the Lube Cube. The Lube Cube. So let's go through its stats here. Yeah. Do you want to expound on the Lube Cube a little bit before I keep going?
I remember working on this particular monster, and I remember tears were coming down everyone's eyes as we were laughing about all of the different implications of this monster.
Yeah, it's not going to be as funny as we read it here, but let your imagination run wild. The Lube Cube. It is solitary. It's large. It's magical. It's devious. Why is it devious?
I don't know.
How'd that get in there? It's a construct and it's amorphous. Okay. Its main move is called Gel Slam. Okay, whatever. D8 damage, 1 piercing. It has 23 hit points for some reason. I'm not sure how it ended up with so many hit points, but there it is. We ended it all into the little codex thing, and that's how it went. So
yeah, or like its instinct is to stop because it's frictionless under its special qualities.
Yes, the special qualities are it's frictionless. It comes in assorted flavors. It's made to fit large, long monsters into tight dungeon passageways. And it's water soluble. Its instinct is to stop, which takes, you have to I know the first time I read this when you guys presented it to us, I was like, to stop? What does that mean? And then it took a minute and I realized it was frictionless. So its moves are fill every crevasse, cause a warm tingling, and cause helpless slipperiness. That's the Lube Cube.
The Lube Cube.
And now that we've done the Lube Cube, maybe that's the end of the show. I don't know.
Episode 51, that's it.
That's it. We're finished. Anyway, I thought it was super fun.
I was reticent to put this out there in the world, but off it goes, slipping into the night.
You know what I loved about this when we were talking about it was, Fowler was one of the people who was there, and Fowler, the rest of us were kind of, I distinctly remember this. The rest of us were kind of laughing, ha ha ha, fit big, long monsters down tight dungeon passageways, right? But what I loved about it was Fowler was going into the real, logical applications for this monster.
No, it makes total sense.
Yeah,
a wizard invented this thing to get those monsters down there.
Yeah, if you're a wizard putting together a dungeon, you need some way of getting these giant monsters down into these, down these corridors and stuff, and so. Anyway, I distinctly remember that part of the conversation. It was enjoyable.
my favorite aspect of it was just the the implications of what this monster's attack would be like. It's just moving so fast and so uncontrollable. Like, it can't even control itself that well, that you would just hear like a screaming noise as it just flew by you, and then inside your armor everywhere as you slip and fall onto the ground would just be, bubblegum flavored or strawberry flavored or whatever, just everywhere.
Right. Yeah. It's like you got slimed, like in Ghostbusters, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Slime.
Charming is probably the right word.
Yes. We love
monster.
the Lube Cube. Anyway, that's all I got.
All right. Let's move on to our next segment if people are still listening.
Please do. This episode of Discern Realities is being sponsored by Scablands Press. I want to tell you about Scablands' upcoming game, Dust, Fog, and Glowing Embers. In Dust, Fog, and Glowing Embers, you enter a world at the cusp of its industrial age. You embody characters that have to face a world in which all kinds of strange physical laws apply. This is a science fiction game, although from the perspective of a version of the proto-industrial past. Your characters are special because they have access to spagyric essences. Spagyric essences are plant-based alchemical substances that allow them to become as rarefied as mist, light fires by exuding sparks, or whip up dust storms to blind their enemies. These essences make the characters the perfect tool for unsavory people to exploit. Dust, Fog, and Glowing Embers also has several short supplements that were unlocked during the campaign. These supplements, collectively called a walking tour of Stome, detail strange and interesting locations throughout the city of Stome, which is the game's setting. Here's a description of one of those locations: the Albion Pettigrew School for Boys and Snakes. One of the most prestigious boarding schools in the city, and a highly regarded institution for the study of vipers, snakes, and serpents. Boys at the Pettigrew School receive a world-class education in discipline, etiquette, and the various serpentine mysteries, including the reading of scales and the translation of hisses. It is no mistake the city's very best snake handlers are usually accompanied by rapturous cheers of, "You can always tell a Pettigrew man." Dust, Fog, and Glowing Embers will be releasing soon. For more information, go to the Scablands website, and thanks to Slade and Scablands for sponsoring the show.
Our next segment is What is About to Happen. Last time on this segment, we saw St. Evelyn the White entering the center of Felbit Village, where there was a large crowd that was difficult to see past, but for a moment, St. Evelyn pushed in and could get a look at what was in the center of the mass, and there was a crudely constructed cage of wire with melted glass on it that something was inside of. It clearly wasn't human, but you didn't get a really good look at it through the crowd. You also saw a man who is identifiable as a priest who is potentially sympathetic to your particular style of beliefs. He was very Spartan, just wearing kind of brown robes with a rope around his waist, and he had no symbol to speak of, which was revealing in itself. But that is the situation. The crowd has just started to cause the wire cage to collapse inward and tighten around this creature, and you could hear them all kind of getting louder, and the creature starting to make a terrible noise as this sharp cage is getting closer on it. What do you do?
I go up to the gentleman wearing the sort of simple robe, and it's pretty clear the crowd doesn't care about me, and so I just walk right up to him, and I say, "Brother, what's going on here?"
"Oh, sister." And he looks you up and down, admiring your white robes for a moment before he catches himself and kind of goes back to being more stoic, but somewhat approving of the situation that's unfolding before them. "We have captured one of them. One of the Stitched."
One of the Stitched. Does that ring a bell? Might I know something about the Stitched?
Maybe.
I'll spout lore, if that's okay.
Sure.
I got an 11.
Very good. So something interesting and something useful. The interesting thing is that The Stitched are local to this area only. They are not found anywhere else in the world. So I'll be curious to hear where you have heard of them from, or how you know of them. The useful thing is they are the blight that is upon these people. If you have a way or find a way of taking care of them, these people will be well within your debt, and you could influence them for your faith.
I assume at this point that I'm close enough to get a better look at the creature at this point.
You could push into the crowd to get a better look at it, definitely.
I'd like to do that. I want to just see what it looks like. And then I'll also answer if you want to ask me like how I know.
Yeah, how do you know that the Stitch are what their deal is with this village and this place?
Yeah, let me think about it for a minute. But in the meantime, as I get closer, I mean, what does it look like, the creature? I'd like to get a good look.
So it looks like it has the vague shape of a man, but it has attached to it very, very much at random, not like clothing or in a pattern that is discernible to you, animal hides and other flesh from lizards, from bird feathers, and they're all crudely stitched directly onto its skin, or whatever is holding it. It's being held together by all kinds of animals' flesh and skin.
When I was a little girl, my family traveled through this region. My family was not a particularly religious family, and this was some years before the current troubles. We traveled, and we were part of I guess the sort of real world equivalent would be like a circus or a carnival or a freak show of some sort, right? And our family, we were mostly like, we worked, we kind of like put up the tents and took care of the animals and things like that, right? We weren't performers. This circus had one of these things, right? I think they had one. And that's how I know about them.
The crowd is just bearing down on it and causing the wires with the glass to cut into the creature. You can see several people are like pulling on ropes that are attached to the cage, to strategic parts of it, to cause it to kind of draw in on itself. And it's starting to cut this thing all to ribbons. It's not bleeding, but it's definitely being cut in deep, and it seems to be struggling, and it seems to be frustrated. It seems to be making noises of frustration more than it seems to be making noises of pain.
Almost as if, like, it can't feel it or whatever, right?
Right.
Okay.
These creatures are what the army is fighting.
As I'm sitting here watching this scene, I know that this is how groups of people behave when they're angry and they're frightened. I've seen it many times. I've seen communities of people who, in an effort to make themselves feel better, just to achieve some sort of catharsis, they engage in terrible acts of cruelty. They, communities burning women who are believed to be witches, right? Because they think that's going to make everything better, right? Often these things don't make anything better. All they do is they provide a momentary release. And I'm thinking that there's more to be gained by releasing the creature, freeing the creature, questioning it, finding out what the Stitched want. And so I find high ground, and I stretch out my arms, and I begin to call out to the crowd. I begin to preach. Good people of Felbit, hear my words. You have suffered much. But harming this creature, destroying this creature, will not bring any ease to that suffering. You're acting out of anger. You're acting out of a misguided notion that if you can just punish one more of them, then maybe you'll frighten them off, that all this will be over. But I am here to tell you, in the name of the man and the woman, of Oron and Lunon, you will release this creature. You will find another way. I'm going to roll plus charisma. That's lead the flock. That's an 8. The move says I get to hold 1. And I can spend my hold for a number of things. And I'm going to choose bring people forward and deliver them to me. In this case, I want them to deliver the creature to me.
The crowd gets quiet at your words, and even the stoic priest turns and watches you, and people start to slack off of pulling on the cage, and the creature stops making as much noise, and even it seems to be watching you. And then, as they're all watching you instead of the cage, the creature pulls itself through the wire that is now slack and not drawn tight against it, and pulls itself out, and its legs get removed from its torso as it does this process. And it starts to crawl across the ground towards you. And the crowd step out of its way. And they seem kind of maybe ashamed of what they're doing a little bit. Like your words have caused them to almost regret what they're doing. But then they just kind of look down and are more disgusted with it. And can see that it is defeated. And they're less interested in hurting it. And the crowd just kind of disperses. But that priest, he keeps watching you and watching the creature slowly dragging itself in your direction. And it's making a low moaning sound. And there's just this low moaning sound, and then a crying baby as a woman moves her child to her breast to feed it. And the low thumping of this crowd dispersing. That just leaves one final question. Who's really in control here?
Discern Realities is a production of The Gauntlet. We can be found on our community page of G+. Just go to the community section of G+, and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. We're on Twitter at GauntletRPG. And if you'd like to support us on Patreon, it's patreon.com/gauntlet.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, listeners. That's our show.